the first SPIs where it was a lot of Birkenstocks and some fun parties.
Dan Sugar still does that. You can say his name out loud. He's been on this podcast twice. So if you saw Dan in his Birkenstocks and then playing his guitar later, then
You get the OGs that still rock the Birks.
was it 40,000, 50,000, more? Whatever the number, there were a lot of people at RE Plus in Las Vegas this year. While the exhibit hall floor is a focal point of the event, especially for procurement pros sourcing solar panels, inverters, and batteries, the real action takes place in the side rooms, restaurants, and bars scattered along the strip. I'm John Engel, Content Director for Renewable Energy World. This week on Factor This, I'm joined by Scott Wiater, CEO of Standard Solar, who's taking us inside those critical conversations. Wiater shares the buzz around the Inflation Reduction Act implementation headaches, financial market turmoil, and somehow optimism that the industry will continue its meteoric growth. That's all next on Factor This from Renewable Energy World. Scott Wiater, thanks so much for joining the Factor This podcast. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you, John.
I have long wanted to get you on the podcast. We only met about a week ago at RE Plus, so that was the good introduction and opportunity for us to get to this point. But I think that what you guys are doing at Standard Solar is really impressive, and it's been a big year for you. You've had a lot of change, the Brookfield deal, which we'll get into a bit more, and the just overall changes that we're seeing within the distributed generation landscape as Standard and others grow their portfolios and really try to make a dent here. So looking forward to all of that. But first, if we could start off, you've got a fascinating background, and would love to hear your origin story and how you wound your way to Standard eventually.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me first off. So my background is interesting, I suppose. So I spent some time in the Army. I was flying helicopters. I did that for about 10 years as an aviation officer. Decided to get out and try my hand in the civilian world, which was a shock to my family because I was third generation pilot. My dad was Air Force, so he thought I was crazy. And
Mine too.
everybody in our family just said, "What are you doing? You just stay and retire. That's what you do." But I wanted to give it a try. So I left the Army in 2000, and then I actually went to a long haul fiber optic switching company that was very high tech. It was 2000. It was the tech bubble. It was super exciting. Everybody was a millionaire except me, of course. Did that for several years. Left that, and I went into RFID. When RFID was just kind of starting, which was super exciting for me. I got to travel the world looking to set up supply chains to manufacture RFID labels. Did that for several years. Motorola ended up buying the company that I was part of, and they wanted to relocate me to Chicago. Really wasn't interested at that time, so I decided to leave. I went spend a little bit of time working for one of our customers that was integrating RFID. Private equity had just bought that company. They came in, and that was really my first experience with private equity and really revamping a company. We divested our European division, and it was fascinating. But then I got hired on by Standard Solar. Boutique private equity bought Standard Solar in 2008. They brought me on in 2008 to run the company. We had similar backgrounds. The two principals of the boutique private equity were Army guys, so we spoke that common Army language. So it was good. It was a small company at the time. I would say probably around 10 folks. Not much capital behind us. We were primarily residential at the time, but it was exciting. So we grew the company. We started working our way into the commercial sector. One of our first commercial projects was the DOE headquarters building downtown DC, which if you're in solar, that's a fantastic first commercial project
That's
to
not
work
bad.
on.
Not bad.
we
How did you
we use
win that? How
that.
did you win that contract? Let's
We
before
were
we move
actually
on.
subcontractor to,
Okay,
yeah, we were actually subcontractor to SunPower at the time.
got it.
Um, but it was fantastic. We ended up doing several demonstration projects on the roof of the DOE. They had one big system, and then they had several demonstration projects up there as well. And then so we ended up divesting our residential business. That was around the 2013, 2014 timeframe, and we focused solely on C&I and the commercial space. Um, Fast forward to 2017, gas distribution company in Quebec ended up purchasing the company. We did that through a formal process, and they bought the company, um, and they owned it until last year when Brookfield bought the company. But back in 2017, that's when we really shifted our business model to owning assets versus developing, building, and selling. So since 2017, we've been owning all the assets for the most part that we are involved with. And then Brookfield, another formal process was run. Brookfield acquired us in September, so it's been almost to the day a year. So that's been a very interesting ride for sure. And it's really been fun to watch the company grow. Um, just this week, we're opening up we had half a floor on the building we're in. We just this week are doing our ribbon cutting on our expansion for our headquarters building. So it's fun to watch the company grow, and it's been an exciting journey.
When you've grown with the company too, so that's kind of the interesting thing about Standard Solar's evolution is you came in at a pretty good time, relatively speaking, as this industry matured and really took shape in the U.S. and making that transition into commercial and eventually community solar, of which you are a leader in the market, was well timed with the ascendance of that segment. I would say. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. Certainly, it's been a rocky run, but lots of peaks and valleys. But it's been, we've been pretty conservative and steady throughout. And I think that's been one of the secrets to our longevity is we're not huge risk takers, and we're conservative in the way we approach things. We our mantra here is we do what we say we're going to do, and we try to be very ethical in how we approach the market. And sometimes the solar industry feels like the Wild West, and I think having a steady partner has been part of our success for sure.
I'm sure you've been asked in interviews before to probably a million times to pull on that thread of your time in the Army and what you take away from, that part of your life into now leading a company and driving decarbonization and clean energy. But was that mentality sourced in your time in the service and just the structure of the company being led by veterans like yourself and that steady hand approach seems to not be an anomaly here?
I think so. I think two things. One, being an officer in the Army, certainly you're asked to do a lot of different things. I'm a platoon leader one day, and then the next day I'm the S1, which is basically the head of HR. And my last assignment, I was a company commander. I had like 500 soldiers. I had over 500 soldiers under my command as a
Much bigger than
young
standard.
30-year-old kid, right? Well, young adult. So the amount of responsibility was huge, and it was dangerous, right? So the good thing is, knock on wood, no one is dying if I make the wrong decision with this company. Safety is always top of the um, concern issue for me, and so we always do things the right way and the safe way. But if I make a wrong decision, no one's going to die from it. In the military, is slightly different. If you make the wrong decision, you could put people's lives at jeopardy. So for me, that's been a good way to reflect on, okay, when things aren't going exactly right, I have time to reflect and to make solid decisions and gather some data, and I don't have to act instantly. So it's been good. I think just having that level of responsibility that the military asks of you builds that confidence and the leadership. You have to have strong leadership to be successful both there and in a role like this. And so I think that's been instrumental to our success as well.
Do the crises just seem to be on totally different levels when you frame it like that and it seems pretty obvious, but we talk about these hurdles and headwinds that the industry faces, whether it's capital or interest rates or tariffs, module supply, all these kinds of things seem pretty insignificant when you frame it against the backdrop of people could have died in my last job.
They are, however, they are still extremely frustrating, and they do keep me up at night. And I put a lot of consideration into how they're going to affect the business. I think one of the other keys to being successful in this industry is you have to be able to look out and be a good chess player and try to be 3 moves ahead of everybody else to be successful, because it's a constantly shifting landscape in this industry for sure.
You alluded to rocky moments. You alluded to what keeps you up at night, a question I ask pretty much everyone who comes on this podcast, and one that I think I asked you last week when we met in Las Vegas. And what I appreciated about that conversation was that I feel that you're very forthcoming and candid about where the industry sits, what you guys are trying to do at Standard Solar, and the state of play. Whereas sometimes I speak to executives and CEOs in this industry who like to feed me the press release after press release and don't give me much beyond that. And the reason I wanted to follow up on our chat, more informally at RA Plus and do it here is because I think that your perspective is something that our audience will find valuable. So with all that said, what were some of those rocky moments, as you mentioned, as Standard Solar was growing up and along with the industry, but facing the challenges not only that face any business, but also those navigating a policy framework that can oftentimes be daunting?
Well, it's certainly changed throughout the years, and the challenges, as soon as we conquer one, we seem to have another one pop up. Through the years, one of the biggest challenges is this is a very capital intensive business. And so managing cash is critical to being successful in this business. And I really don't care what segment of the business you're in. We were an EPC, we were a residential installer, and we've kind of done a little bit of all the roles except for manufacturing. We've never done manufacturing.
I wouldn't recommend it. It's pretty
it's
tough.
A capital intensive. It's tough, and it's lots of peaks and valleys, and you have to be able to manage your cash to get through those tough times, because it is a lot of really good days and then some not so good days where you're really scraping by to figure out how you're going to make payroll. So there were times at Standard Solar before we had well-backed, big balance sheet owners where it was tricky, and we were concerned on how to manage cash and, quite frankly, how to make payroll, to where executives were getting together and actually giving loans to the company. So for sure that was nerve-wracking. I would say current concerns for us are really more wrapped around the IRA, and the IRA has been a great thing, and it's a blessing and a curse all at the same time. Tax equity is a extremely complex and complicated way of financing these projects.
That's a
and
theme on the show. The tax equity is a mess and super inefficient. We talk about it probably every episode.
And what the IRA did was it made that complex, difficult to navigate system more complex and more difficult to navigate. So I really think it's the tax equity providers that are going to dictate and tell us what the true rules and how they interpret the rules. Certainly we'll get the guidance from the Treasury and the IRS, but it'll be tax equity and their attorneys that really pick it apart and tell us what rules we have to follow to make sure we don't trip over any of the underlying requirements. The one that gives me the most concern, quite frankly, right now, has to do with the labor side of it and the apprenticeship and the prevailing wage. Prevailing wage, I'm totally comfortable with. We can manage through that. We've done lots of projects that require prevailing wage type requirements. the apprenticeship, I think, could be a big stumbling block for us. Because if you don't do it right and you don't document it right, it's not as though you're losing a little bit. You lose a huge chunk of the tax benefits.
It's like
And I
10%, right?
think, I'm sorry, what?
It's like 10% of the
No, it's
stack,
way
isn't it?
more than that.
Oh,
Yeah, you go from the 30% base down to like 8%.
oh, that's right.
Uh, so it's a huge impact. And more concerning than that is tax equity. It's really takes it to zero if you look at it, because tax equity is either going to be comfortable with it or they're not. And if they're not comfortable with it, they're not going to enter into the deal with you. And then you're scrambling for tax equity. So I believe, that's a deal killer for sure if you trip on that. And I believe that every tax equity provider is going to have a different interpretation and requirements to make sure they're comfortable with those issues. And no one right now is going to really give you that until they know the full story. So we're starting projects now that we expect to benefit from the IRA, um, but we don't have the rules. So that is concerning for us. Just trying to make sure we do it the right way.
So do you think that's a
Um,
big reason that I'm hearing from developers throughout the space that tax equity has somewhat frozen or paused just due to some of the uncertainty around the IRA implementation? Is it hinging on that kind of apprenticeship labor aspect? Because just a quick aside there, I have spoken to leaders of EPCs and vertically integrated developers who say we just put our people through a very expensive apprenticeship program of our own. It won't qualify for under the Treasury Department standards. So we got to do it all again. And those programs that do qualify are not there aren't many of them. And making sure that you comply with those standards very strictly is crucial, as you mentioned.
it is crucial. To answer your first question, I don't think that's what you're seeing in tax equity right now. I think what you're seeing, I think you will in the future see that, but I don't think that's hit us yet. I think what you're seeing in tax equity right now is that it is becoming more scarce. I think inflation, and just the current environment, the capital markets environment, has made the tax equity providers, um, really be selective on who they're going to do deals with. So they're looking at folks that have scale, that have big backers, that they're more comfortable with. So I think both the tax equity and the debt markets are being more selective as capital becomes more constrained in this high interest rate environment. I think that gives us a tremendous advantage, and there'll be a handful of companies in our space, in the DG community solar space, because there aren't that many players that have that big backing. So I do think it gives us a competitive advantage, and that the tax equity will be available to those that have the big balance sheet backers.
Well, I was just going to ask, kind of what that's doing to your portfolio near term. You mentioned having the stability of Brookfield certainly helps, but are you having to reprioritize projects that are in the pipeline or, you know, slow the process at all?
Oh, no, we're trying to speed up the process, quite frankly. Um, all of those other things you mentioned before, the labor shortages, the supply chain constraints, the AHJs and the permitting challenges, the interconnection challenges. We have plenty of challenges to overcome that's impeding our goals from a volume standpoint. So we're full speed ahead, get as much done as we can because we're behind, and we're building up this huge backlog of projects under construction, and just getting them uh, from notice to proceed to turned on and permission to operate from the utilities. That has really lagged pre-COVID to now. Um, it's We're seeing something like 150 days of delays on average right now from pre-COVID days. So we're working very hard to improve efficiencies to bring that back to a reasonable timeline, um, to get going. If we're going to meet any of the goals that not only do we set for ourselves, but the Biden administration and the climate watchers are looking at, we've got a lot of work, and we are so far behind, and the timelines are getting longer, not shorter, which isn't going to help things. And we'll never get there at this pace.
You told me a story when I spoke to you last week about that lag and extended timeline between NTP and commissioning that I would love for you to kind of rehash here. And in that, can you drill down into a specific project and sort of walk us through step by step and what's happening and what is so challenging in terms of getting the utility to let you move forward? Like, what does that look like in reality?
In the old days, in the early days of solar, which really wasn't that long ago, say 10 years ago, um, actually even more recent than that, but we used to be able to turn on our systems to do all of our tests prior to permission to operate. Um, the utilities have been much more strict now, and I get it. I don't blame them for this, but now you have to have permission to operate in almost all jurisdictions to test your system. So we used to be able to work out all the kinks prior to PTO, and then when it was time for the witness test and PTO, everything was working perfectly, and we turned on our system, and we had much fewer issues. Now the normal course is we'll request a witness test from the utility. The utility comes out to watch this witness test, and then there'll be something not work. An inverter won't power up, something won't work right. And so the typical response from most utilities, and some utilities are much better than others, but most utilities will say, when you have it right, you call us back. Um, and to get back in the queue, and it could be something so simple as that we could fix on spot in a half hour, but most utilities won't wait. So what they do is they say, get back in queue and schedule another witness test. Sometimes that can be 6 weeks. So if you're hitting the timing wrong, you next thing you know, you blink and it's 6 months for relatively minor issues. So I think better collaboration between the utilities and the developers and the EPCs is needed to get these systems up and running in a more reasonable time.
You mentioned too
Also,
about the aspect of like if that witness date is scheduled on a cloudy day, they show up, look up, clouds are out. Sorry, I'll have to come back another time, and it resets the clock. Like that's kind of wild.
that's right. And some utilities are requiring ridiculous requirements, like they want to see the system produce 90% of its nameplate capacity. Well, obviously that's during the summer, and especially if you're in the Northeast where the winter months are not near as good from an irradiance perspective as it is in the summer, it really narrows the window when you can show them what they want to see. So we have to get reasonable tests and get some common sense going and how these utilities are looking at it. Um, I think that's key.
Well, you called for collaboration between developers, utilities, and EPCs. So I'd get in trouble if I didn't do the shameless plug that the event that we run, Grid Tech Connect Forum, is designed to bring together that developer, asset owner, the utility, and the regulator grid operator around the issue of DG interconnection. We'll be in the Northeast, Newport, Rhode Island. You've probably heard the ads already on this podcast, October 23rd through the 25th. But Standard Solar has been a huge asset for us in putting that effort together. Your CJ Colavito from your engineering team is on our advisory board and is, as I've mentioned to you and many others, one of the just coolest guys that this industry has, and one of the smartest too, but just a nice person. So, we're happy to have him involved. Getting back into the Brookfield deal a little bit, why did that make sense for you last year in that moment? And kind of what was the origin around? Were you seeking a new partner? Were you up for sale from your previous investor? How did that all come together?
So Integer, who owned us previously, was a fantastic partner and did great things for the company. And we're very grateful with where they brought the company. We were growing at a pace that I think just quite frankly wasn't aligned with the goals that they had. They have several businesses that they own, not just Standard Solar. They own several other platforms. And so looking at it, we had a couple choices. We wanted to grow rapidly. Management here thought that we could really grow this company into something very significant. And Integer was very supportive of that. So I think we talked through it together and we said, hey, we're going to need a lot of capital going forward. Is that something that's in your investment horizon? Markets at the time were very lucrative to sell a platform like Standard Solar. So, um, to their credit, Integer said, yeah, we should run a process and we should see what's available out there. So we did that. It was a very successful process. Integer was very good through the process. Brookfield was an ideal candidate to buy us. We, as management, were very excited about joining Brookfield. You know, the thing about Brookfield for me is, uh, yes, they have a ton of capital backing behind them, and they've committed that capital to Standard Solar, which we're truly grateful for. But they understand the industry we're in. They're in the industry we're in. They're smart people, both as private equity investors, super sharp. I've been extremely impressed over the last year with the level of talent that they are able to attract. But they also know our business very, very well. So I'm not having to educate my investors while I go
That's
through
huge.
this. They're just there it is. So for us, it's been a very, very good collaboration, and I'm truly grateful that they've been as supportive as they have up to this point.
Yeah, it's not just a PE shop with, ESG goals and a couple $1 billion. It's a very focused effort. And I think within a year, Brookfield acquired you. They acquire Scout? Is that the other name that was within the announcement of the Standard Solar acquisition? I feel like Scout Clean Energy was that other one.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was. Yeah, it was a joint press release with Scout
I
when
was
they announced our acquisition, which we were kind of bummed. We're like, oh, we have to share the spotlight.
I get that, yes, but that was quite the bombshell because Scout's pretty well established on in their own right and doing a
Yeah,
lot of wind and utility scale stuff out west. And we've reported on a number of their projects. But then Brookfield went and bought Duke Energy's utility scale renewables business too. So like this is a rapid expansion. They are looking to put money to work immediately and clearly trying to source projects that bring value to their balance sheet, not just search around for whatever is on the trash heap out there that probably gets passed around 4 or 5 times before RE Plus even finishes. But because that's kind of the
yeah.
vibe sometimes when you hear about a project changing hands so many times in a short number of years, then there might be a problem there. What does the Brookfield integration mean for the business? Are you going to continue to operate under the Standard Solar banner? Are you able to accelerate that portfolio? What kind of efficiencies can you find, and how does that road look for you?
So we plan to operate as Standard Solar and be an independent platform with the backing of Brookfield is how it's structured. Um, it's really just having a partner like Brookfield brings a lot to the table. Just relationships alone are invaluable. We talked a lot about tax equity. We talked a lot about uh, the capital markets. Clearly, they have great footholds into the capital market. So being able to leverage that, they know the space. So from a supply chain perspective,
Yeah,
we hope that we can, if nothing else, have a strategic look. We get the benefit of companies like Scout and
right.
Urban Grid's another one that they acquired. So we have a lot of knowledge and a lot of knowledge share that can benefit all of the Brookfield companies that really is invaluable that I think is unique within the industry.
Well, and you weren't going to be able to put in multi-gigawatt module orders for, American-made solar panels before an acquisition like that either, but a Brookfield can, and they'll distribute those among you and Scout and all the subsidiaries, whatever becomes of Duke's utility scale business, whatever that gets called. So I imagine that allows you to take advantage of that scale while still being that nimble, independent player. Is that kind of the idea here?
It is, you know, it's interesting because I always joke that, we're going to grow this company to be more significant from a megawatt perspective than the utility players. It's hard in DG because it's a lot of
It's a
projects,
grind. Yeah.
but we do have huge growth forecasts in front of us, both as an industry. And, here at Standard Solar, we think we're going to capture more market share. We already have a decent amount of market share, but if we just maintain market share, our growth trajectory is huge. So we're super excited about that. We want to keep that nimble, entrepreneurial mindset as we go forward, but it's tough as you get bigger. So balancing all of that is key to our success.
Does it take a weight off of you a little bit? Just knowing that like the payroll issues that you've had to deal with in years past before you reach this size may not be of such near-term concern under a heavyweight like Brookfield?
Payroll's not my concern anymore. Now my concerns are I want to hit my targets. I've always been um, that mindset of I want to exceed what I say I'm going to do. So for me, it's always pushing, pushing, pushing. We want to be the number one DG community solar company out there. So we're very focused on achieving that. Um, and we look at what our competition's doing, but we're not focused on what the competition is doing. There's plenty of business out there in the space, and we can grow this company and be a force to be reckoned with, just by doing the right thing within our own company.
Well, and look, you won't say it, but you guys are in that company too, with the Next Amps and Blue Waves and name your DG platform. But you guys have really grown at a perfect clip as community solar has expanded throughout the country, and you're approaching new markets and adding assets, growing the portfolio, and like you said, trying to do it the right way and not cut corners and deliver on promises. Whereas other platforms that try to go too fast, too quickly, and get overexposed and buy bad assets and rush projects and go for the cheapest equipment may be running into some challenges in the next few years as those capital markets dry up to a degree and investors become smarter about where their money is going and the electrons that you're generating. Are any lessons that you take away from Standard Solar's growth for those other platforms? You mentioned there's plenty of business to go around, but where do companies in this space make the biggest mistake as they're transitioning from, say, a developer flipping at NTP to trying to own and operate these assets as an IPP?
I think as an industry as a whole, the folks that are taking the shortcuts, it's always competitive. It depends if you're a developer selling projects or if you're offering PPAs, so it's the cost of the PPA. People are always trying to race to the lowest, most attractive offer, whatever space they're in. And you can do that by cutting corners, and a lot of folks do, unfortunately. A lot of developers who are selling their projects get attracted to that shiny, great bid that they see. That's what I tell my business development folks all the time is that offer is not real, and that project will be circulated around next year when that deal falls through. And unfortunately, we see that a lot, and usually those become reality where you see those projects that you lose because somebody offered them this ridiculous price, and then that project surprisingly, shockingly doesn't get done, and it gets recirculated, and then usually we're successful in getting that project. So being patient and not cutting corners, I think is super important. If it seems too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Um, Having a sound, I think we're getting slightly better. I think the capital markets and the tax equity providers and the debt providers are forcing it, but having a spec that you can build these projects to that are going to last for a long time is important. So if you're building it to just flip it out in the next year or two, and you're cutting those corners because you don't care how the system's going to perform in 10 years, that asset, the first person who sells it might do okay, the second person might do but then somebody's going to be left holding that bag of a distressed asset that's going to need to be repowered or retrofitted to make it up to standard. So cutting those corners, I think, in the long run is bad for the industry, and we need to kind of have better standardized specs across the board.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the outlier lowest bid, or you're contracting with the cheapest EPC, you're likely going to come out with a shoddy project. That's kind of the reality. What would you say the split is between the good leads and the good prospects that you get versus that muck that we've been referring to?
There's a lot of muck, unfortunately. Um, we have some really good partners. So I think Standard Solar has done well in forming their partnerships with regional developers, both sophisticated and not so sophisticated, where we can come in and add some of that sophistication, and they can use us as their synthetic balance sheet. So we'll provide that development capital that these folks need to get their projects across the finish line, and then we'll help them from a technical standpoint get it across the finish line. So I think that's one of the big advantages Standard Solar brings. But yeah, it depends where the projects are in their life cycle. Um, at RE Plus, it was interesting to me. It seems as though a lot of folks are now selling assets that uh, over the last couple of years they may have said we're going to keep these assets. I saw a lot of those type of companies offering assets for sale.
That had
I
made the
think
transition to IPP and are
they
now
had
kind of.
made the transition and now they're back to selling some assets. I think it'll be difficult for folks to get money's going to be expensive, and
Yep.
as money gets more expensive and it's not free anymore, it's difficult for folks to, and it's capital intensive. So I think you'll see folks recycling projects to raise capital, because I think capital is going to be a constraint, especially for the smaller uh, players out there. So I think that's an opportunity. And I also think you're seeing markets. Maine's a good example where the project has to be built by the end of 2024, and they have these outside deadlines that we're bumping up against. And also in markets like Maine, offtake is an issue where you have so many projects in the queue and you don't have enough offtake. So there's offtake uncertainty, which I think derates the value of those projects. So uh, it's very regional, and it's scattered all over the map in terms of where the risks and where the muck is.
Everyone that I speak with who is developing projects in Maine looks exhausted. That might be one of the
Yeah,
toughest states to play in right now. Um, from
yeah.
a regulatory standpoint, it's slow. Uh, it's just difficult to get projects online, and they don't come at the size that it makes sense to spend years developing these projects either. Like I last RE Plus, not this most recent, the one in Anaheim. I remember speaking to a developer with a pretty good footprint in the Northeast that was trying their hardest to push through a project in Maine, and I think he was flying from Anaheim back to Maine to get in front of a PUC proceeding or something like that, and he just looked exhausted. that's my takeaway of what that market looks like right now. Do you guys have projects in Maine? Who's exhausted on your
We do.
team?
We have some exhausted folks on our team.
That's funny. Well, I'm glad you took it in the direction of RE Plus, because I do want to spend the next part of our conversation diving into a little bit more the conversations that you were having with a variety of folks, whether it's on the procurement side, or you're talking to investors or project developers. Let's start with some of the major themes that you take away from the show this year. You I assume go every year to RE Plus, formerly SPI. What sticks out to you as the talking points that kept coming up, good and bad?
My takeaway of RE Plus was it was huge, which is good. People were excited, which is also good. So I think people are generally excited about the future of the industry, and the industry has really grown up from the first SPIs before it was RE Plus, where it was a lot of Birkenstocks and um, some fun parties.
Dan
So
Sugar
now you
still
see a lot
does
more
that.
suits.
You can say his name out loud. He's been on this podcast twice. So if you saw Dan in his Birkenstocks and then playing his guitar later, then that probably lines up
Yeah.
with that reputation that you just laid out.
Yeah, you get the OGs that still rock the Birks, but so it's an interesting show. and it's grown up to be. We used to just take certain people to the show, a more select group. Now it really I take folks from every department because engineers it's beneficial to. It's beneficial to the business development because there's deals being talked about. It's interesting for the capital markets folks because there's a lot of discussion around the capital markets and tax equity and debt and what facilities are out there. So it's really grown up to be all encompassing from that perspective. I will say I picked up on awkward nervousness, I think, around the IRA, around just the environment with the rising interest rates. I think there's some concern that tax equity will become scarce if the economy doesn't perform. Uh, then obviously folks won't have a lot of tax equity to go around, so it'll be much more selective on who gets that tax equity. So that was my big takeaway of the show. I saw a lot of talk of projects hitting the market that I think there's a lot of activity, which is good. So I think it will be good for. I do think you'll see consolidation continue. I don't think it's an ideal market for platforms like Standard Solar. I think that window's closed for a short duration. I think it'll come back. I think it's several years out before platform values come back. And I think interest rates have a lot to do with that, right? So, and
In terms of Standard Solar buying another platform or just buying assets in general?
both,
Okay.
we're always on the lookout for M&A that would make sense, that's accretive. We're pretty established, and buying another platform like Standard Solar, it would have to make a lot of sense, and there'd have to be a lot of synergies and not a lot of duplication to make that make sense for us. Unfortunately, I think we're entering an environment where you could see some distressed platforms out
Yeah.
there. So perhaps there'll be consolidation through attrition of just folks getting over their head, um, counting on those interest rates to come down faster than they're going to come down. And that's a tough environment. So I hope not. I want the industry to grow for all, but I do think there'll be some targets of opportunity going forward.
I think you're absolutely right. And just speaking anecdotally, and I've mentioned it before on this podcast, that I get names thrown at me all the time of like, hey, keep an eye on these guys. They're buying a lot. I know cash flow is an issue. This rate environment is not good for cash strained growth platforms. It's dangerous, and you've experienced that to a degree scaling Standard Solar too. As you try to grow, you also have to balance that with, like, once you get these assets on the balance sheet, you have to get returns to make any of this make sense, and have stable capital, patient capital behind you to weather the storm and get you through those valleys when you're experiencing interconnection delays or dealing with the witness at the utility not showing up for 8 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, whatever it is. That price just keeps going up. And if your expectations are, we're going to bid low, we're going to get a lot of projects, we're going to buy everything we can see, you know, eventually there comes a point where you have to deliver. And I think this is a really tricky environment. I probably 4 or 5 names of somewhat considerable scale in the DG space that I get thrown at me when people say, a year to 18 months would not be out of the question to see these assets go up for sale. So I hear that
You
a
can
lot.
tell me those names if
I'm
you
happy
want.
to. I'll chat with you offline and set something up. I have a pretty low commission, but I love facilitating relationships. But you're right too. Like, we don't want to see anyone fail, but it's a nature of this space that for a long time that money was free, like you said, and now it's not. It's anything but that. So it will be fascinating to watch all that play out. Is that did you hear any of that at the show too, of folks talking about the cash flow issues and just managing the business day to day in this economic environment, and weathering the storm however long it lasts? 'Cause, I mean, from what I hear from the finance people, they're like, yeah, don't expect this to change anytime soon.
There's a lot of talk of it. Everybody, for the most part, says how great they're doing. puts a good face on it when they're out there. But I've had some sidebar conversations where folks are certainly very concerned about where they're going to be in a year. So I think there'll be some good opportunities out there.
Isn't it interesting to compare and contrast last year's RE Plus with this one? Last year, we were maybe 2 weeks removed from President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It was the victory lap, and rightfully so. The folks at SIA and the other trade groups and a lot of industry people, you included, Standard Solar was a part of all this, pushed so hard for that legislation that came out in the dead of night, or I guess it was late afternoon, but it felt like the dead of night. I remember when I first heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, I was making dinner and I saw it on my phone and I audibly gasped. What is this? And how did this happen? I thought it was dead 3 times over the week before. But so we all get together, perfectly timed at RE Plus. Everyone's smiling. It is one of the biggest few weeks the industry had seen in a very long time. And then this year, 12 months later, it's like, oh shit, this is really hard. There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot to this. Did you get that sense too of just like hearing, the change in tone? I thought was stark.
I did. In full disclosure, I wasn't at RE Plus last year because we were in the middle of our Brookfield close. So
that
we were
makes
literally
sense.
closing the deal. So
It was a giant frat party. Everyone
we
was
certainly
celebrating.
had representation there.
Yeah, everyone was happy.
Yeah, we were celebrating here. I agree. Abby and Sia did a great job. They totally deserve their victory lap. But now we have to, where the rubber hits the road, we have to make it happen. And at the end of the day, we need these assets in the ground producing clean energy to do what we all talk about, right? And that's combating this climate change.
Anything worry you about what you heard at the show? A couple of the things that I threw at people, I know I mentioned it to you in our chat too, is like, I'm hearing a lot about performance and reliability issues, dealing with manufacturers and OEMs delivering products that are not performing to expectations. Just kind of general like execution things keep rising to the top for me beyond what we know is happening in the financial markets, which is, I think, a bit more obvious. But project reliability is something that I'm really interested in. But did anything catch you off guard where you go, well, I wasn't expecting to hear that?
Not really. I think we're all seeing the same things. Certainly, we've had some challenges with some of the equipment we've received. So we're constantly validating and making sure we're buying the very best tier 1 equipment that we can procure to make sure our projects will last that long duration that our investment requires of them. So we're constantly doing that. The supply chain, I think, has gotten slightly better, but it still has some challenges that we have to overcome. It's not so much panels anymore. It's shifted to more switch gear and some of the electrical components. So we have to get through all of that. It's the same challenges that we see every year. RE Plus is interesting to me because from my background, when we used to go to the fiber optic conventions like this, somebody would always have a big unveiling of something massive, and there'd be smoke coming from the floor and music playing, and their new product would be like, oh. RE Plus isn't that way. It's here's my new solar panel, and it's 10 watts better than it was last year, and it's huge.
Yeah, they're massive.
So I would love to see some true innovation. Don't get me wrong, there's people innovating, and I appreciate that, but I'm ready for some big innovation to hit the space, and I think we're all ready for it.
So you didn't take any software pitches? That doesn't move the needle.
Well, there's a lot of talk of AI, and I think there's a huge market for AI, especially on the O&M side of our business, and we're looking at it, doing machine learning and AI, and we've got a great team that's focused on that. So, they geek out and they get excited over those opportunities. But no, we haven't.
You mentioned how RE Plus SPI has changed over the years, but the show floor is important to those who use RE Plus just as their one-stop shop. Like, I'm going to buy everything I need for the year. everything else happens off the show floor. It's in the meeting rooms and coffee shops and bars and restaurants. And that's kind of what fascinates me too, is like all of the work that is happening more behind the scenes at the event seems incredibly important. But that's why I shake you a little bit for those storylines and rumblings, because I'm not allowed in those rooms. They see press highlighted on my badge and they go, nope. So that it's nice to kind of hear, the sentiment and where people feel the industry is going. How about for you? Just let's close it out. We're getting close to an hour here, but as you look at the next year for Standard Solar and the broader kind of DG space and clean energy, characterize your level of optimism, as all of the things that we're facing are tough, but it seems like people are pretty excited.
Oh, we're super excited. I think Standard Solar is going to have by far its best year next year, and will continue to grow. The business we're in, we're putting projects into service. So every year we've got this megawatt goal. We're going to put this many megawatts into service. But behind that, we're building up a tremendous pipeline of projects that take time to work their way through. So for every 100 megawatts that we're putting in service, we're putting 300 megawatts into the pipe. So that pipe is just building at such a tremendous rate that 2-3 years down the road, I'm super excited to see what that looks like. Where you're putting in half a gigawatt a year of DG. That's an accomplishment. So I'm looking forward to that.
Scott Wiater, great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, John. Always great.
Thanks again to Scott Wiater for joining the podcast. Factor This is a production of Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy. Join us every Monday as we take on solar's biggest stories with industry leaders who actually move the needle. And please make sure to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factor This from Renewable Energy World.